Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the redefinition, the neo-definition of democracy. What is democracy in the West today? Is it the representative democracy that we once knew and really was a fairly brief, in the overall span of time and history, was a fairly brief episode in political world history? Or is it the will of the people being expressed, or is it something else? Now, the globalists and the World Economic Forum, the deep state, call it what you like, it really amounts to pretty much the same thing, have forced upon us over the last 25 plus years a redefinition or a new definition of what they call democracy. And it's not representative democracy. It's not the will of the people. It's a form of elite consensus. Now, this consensus has been achieved rather disingenuously, but it's been achieved by infiltrating pretty much every institution that we have, whether it's the political party machinery, whether it's institutions such as universities, the public service, or even Hollywood production. It's infiltrated every key area, the media. It's infiltrated every key area and stacked it with, in effect, activists, people that all either share the same view or where the rewards they receive are dependent on them expressing that view. If you look at the lightweights all around the place, I mean, real lightweights, fucking morons. They're being paid and given very prestigious jobs and being paid very, very well and living in waterfront mansions and the like because they're expressing the right views and maybe they can make a connection with the public, that sort of thing. So we've got all these institutions have been infiltrated, judiciary, I mean, the list just goes on. Quangos, any society organization, such as Law Society or any society at all that has any influence anywhere has been stacked and infiltrated and stacked with people. This has been done very methodically, and it's called generically the long march through the institutions. But they've achieved this capacity for consensus. It's not a real consensus, but that now is a democracy. Okay, well, look, we all agree. We've all got our political science and gender studies degrees. So we're highly educated. We're smarter than everyone else. And we agree what should be done. Open borders, the greening, the energy, getting rid of fossil fuels, this sort of thing. We agree. So, hey, that's democracy. Why should those unwashed fucking bums, why should they be deciding government policy? Why do we get their agreement? We agree and that's enough. So that's the new democracy now. Even in communist societies, the most repressive and brutal communist societies, they would still, which I used to marvel as a school kid, I used to marvel, why do they call themselves democratic when they've got this brutal secret police, when you can be arrested for wrongthink? How can that be democratic given the will of the people is not expressed? But talking to people who came out of Soviet Russia in the first wave of migrants coming out of there, most of them Jewish actually, but coming to Australia and elsewhere around the world. And I would always take the opportunity, if I could, of talking to these people and just seeing what they think, getting their view. And bear in mind, I was doing it, at the time, a massive amount of business traveling. So I said, well, how can you say, no, it is democratic? Because we've got a workers' cooperative in the factory, and the workers' cooperative votes on things, and therefore, given we voted on whatever it could be that they're doing in the factory, they could be voting for, say, a new representative of a union or something like that. Or they could be voting in a new commissar, because every factory and everything. You had like a manager that might be managing, if you like, the business side of things. But then it was assumed that communist ideology was part of everything. So you had a political commissar sitting alongside, and the factory manager couldn't do anything unless the political commissar agreed. And they were held to different standards. The commissar had to uphold the ideology, but the factory manager was responsible for for example, producing X amount of widgets a year. But these people would tell me quite straight faced, no, it's democratic. It is democratic. But we couldn't decide anything or vote for anything that was inconsistent with the ideology. So we could vote, but it had to be fully in line with the ideology. In addition, the senior political commissar in the area or the region or the party, whoever it was, could demand that we had another vote. If they didn't like the person we put in, they could just have, don't want that guy, have another vote. So how could that? Well, what it is, we had another vote, so it's democratic. So perception of democracy can vary depending on your point of view. Now, in ideological states where the government is imposed on the people without their consent, the view of democracy is, as long as we all agree, or agreement is imposed, ideologically imposed, then that's still democracy. As long as anyone has a vote on anything, irrespective of whether that vote is what they want or what they've been told to do, or the vote can just be discarded. Whenever there's a vote on something, we can say that's democratic. So all these communist countries with imposed ideology and again, secret police and repressive regimes, they could all claim to be democratic, even though, as we would understand it, representative democracy was nowhere in sight. So now, if you go back through history and look at the Greek version or the Roman version, or any version of where there was some sort of representative level of democracy, and it varied a bit depending on where you are. But just looking at the major ones, Athens as an example, ancient Athens as an example, then the wealthy and the landed class, given that land was the primary, not the only, but the primary source of wealth. Athens had quite a big commercial trading empire. So you found that there were quite a few merchants and those sort of people, ship owners and traders, and that they were also ended up being part of the political class, apart from the landed gentry and that sort of thing. So the idea of having a vote or having a say in government relates to the risk you have to take, the costs you have to meet, the burdens you have to meet, and your supposed, what could you say, your integration into the particularly the upper echelons, but your integration into the economy, the stake you have in society, I suppose is a good way of it. So the Athenians viewed that those who have the biggest stake in the society are the ones that should have a say, and those who there was a slave population or a indentured class population as well, they shouldn't have a say because they have no stake in society, or their stake on a relative basis is the most minimal. Now, in the case of say, going to war, the wealthy citizens were expected to hire a bunch of soldiers and equip them. And it's not cheap to equip them, running horses for cavalry, the metallurgy and the metalwork for making weapons and helmets and breastplates, all that sort of stuff. That's expensive business. The indentured servant and slaves couldn't afford that anyway. So the wealthy people have to pony up the cash to do all that, because they have such a big stake in society and have such a bigger proportional risk and cost. Then they should have a bigger say. So and you saw that same thing playing out in ancient Rome as well. Now things went back and forth, and for example, in ancient Rome, I think it was around 130 BC, the Gracchi brothers, the tribunes of the people, got involved, and you could say the franchise spread there. You also had a situation of where, because the mob was so large, public opinion mattered only insofar as if the mob in large numbers went wild, then or went feral and started running around, then it would be a huge drama, a major drama to put the riot down, which would then leave simmering discontent for many years. Things like that. So the idea was placate the mobs. That was a form of street democracy, if you will. Saying, shit, we've got to give these guys bread and circuses, otherwise they'll revolt. Now, in terms of universal franchise, or even a majority having the franchise, that's a rare thing. Even in the French Revolution, the idea of universal franchise, as we would understand it today, was extremely limited and patchy, and wasn't necessarily practiced in rural areas, and wasn't a reflection of the will of the people. Similarly, the government during the French Revolution, and to a large extent thereafter, was imposed. So you couldn't refuse conscription into the army. You couldn't refuse the army just taking your horses or taking your crop or your harvest. So you had to. So there was an imposed ideological authority in many respects. So this idea of liberty, equality, fraternity was really a catchphrase rather than a practical reality on the ground. Now, there's always been power sharing, and you could argue that this is democracy to some extent. For example, a king or an aristocrat would have a council or an advisory group. Take the kings of Europe, for example, the monarchs of Europe. They would have typically an advisory group made up of the lords. The other, so the king would have like the key aristocrats that would form an advisory council. When fear of civil war was acute, the king had more power, because the lords wouldn't move against the king for fear it would trigger civil war. If civil war was unlikely and there was no threats against the crown, or then the power tended to swing back to the aristocrats, as there was no danger of a civil war. The king's relative value for keeping peace and continuity of government then declined. So you had those sorts of things in play. So that similarly in Britain and other places, England and other places too, parliaments would be put together of again, pretty much the landed gentry, because they argued that, look, we have to bear the cost of warfare, because remember, there's no universal taxation at the time. We have to bear the cost of warfare, producing the weapons, arming and training the various retainers, and so on. So because of that, we need to have some sort of a say over money being spent. That is the level of taxation, or the money they have to raise to go to war or deal with any issues. So there were those sort of parliaments, which, again, the power of the parliaments waxed and waned depending on the position of the monarch and their relative power and concerns over civil war and other factors. For example, if the country looked like it was about to be invaded, then you wanted stable, continuous government, so the power would switch back to the monarchs to some extent. So that there was this to and fro. So the very nature of democracy and who had a say in government changed. Now, what changed, or few things changed modern democracy. Firstly was the American experience, where it was sort of not universal, but there was a lot more people could vote in a selecting the government than could anywhere else in the world. And that gradually sort of morphed into what we see later on saw as universal franchise, that is, everyone having the vote. But what really tipped the modern concept of representative democracy, really tipped it into the universal franchise, was the mass mobilization of all people and resources for World War I. And this was nowhere particularly evident in Britain, France too, and later on to some extent briefly in Germany. But the idea was mass mobilization of people and resources. The citizens, well, I'm going to die for my country. Women who'd never worked before are going to work 12-hour days in factories to produce munitions. Their sons are being killed and their husbands are being killed. And so it created a whole new climate for who should have a say in government, or how a country is governed. So that's when the universal franchise saw the idea behind it really took off. Mass mobilization of people and resources to conduct world war, or conduct total war as it was called at the time. And that happened twice, World War I, of course, World War II, only 20 odd years apart, the two of them. So this created a new concept of democracy, where those who had a stake, that is, giving their lives or giving their time or giving their sons to the country, should be able to vote and should be able to choose their who would represent them. Now, in that stage, at that time, there were district electorates, and in those electorates were people who, with some exception, minor exception, those were people who had lived and grown up in that area all their lives. They knew everybody, and the people in that area that knew that person, or many of them knew, would vote for that person and vote for them to represent them in a federal or national parliament. So there was still a relationship between the people who voted and the people who stood for election, and then the people that were put in the federal parliament. There was that close relationship there. So having universal franchise, certainly initially all men voting. I think initially it was over the age of 23. Having all men voting made sense given the sacrifices you made in war. That later on changed because people could be called up at the age of 18. It therefore was assumed, say at the time of the Vietnam War and around there, that it was only reasonable to give 18-year-olds the vote, given they had to give up their lives and fight on the front line, get shot at, killed, and so on. The Americans and Australians too changed a little bit. If you were going to university, then you didn't have to go to war. You could claim an exemption. So it was only the working class boys that were getting killed. Or at least at grunt level, the senior officers, of course, would come through officer school, and they tended to have come in through college anyway. So this created, and this is the first time in history that you had universal franchise, particularly with people so young. So really the modern day democracy that we understand, the 18-year-olds voting, men and women voting, universal franchise, really is something that began in the late 1960s. So it had a very brief run as the way democracy was to be conducted, and the definition and concept of representative democracy. So it lasted not even 20 years before the major think tanks around the world were thinking, this is untenable. Why the fuck should we have to share power with, why should these people have a say? They're 18 years old and they're working class, they're people pushing a broom, people working in some low paid retail job. They have a say equivalent to mine, and that's not right, said the elites. And so they set about changing it really at that point. And that's where we see the in many manifestations, the globalization of today. It was to create circumstances and environments and conditions to really undo the effect of universal franchise, particularly given to the young. Now, the thing about it was that many governments, Western governments, believed that a mass mobilization of all people and resources event would occur again. Their prognostications were it's going to happen again, especially during that Cold War, and there's going to be war with the Soviet Union and fucking China and all that sort of stuff. So as they looked at the future, they thought we're going to need this mass mobilization again. Therefore, we need to have this universal franchise. Because it was an ill-advised move outside of the need to keep the on side to conduct total war. Aside from that, there was no argument, reasonable, sensible argument at all for mass franchise, universal franchise. Just consider if the vote had been restricted to men over the age of 23 and women over the age of 30. Or 35 or over 30, which tended to be kind of the standard. And you had to have a minimum income. You had to have at least the average income to be able to vote. So just imagine that. The globalists would have never had a chance. Never. They wouldn't have got off the ground because the proportion of sensible people who would need to be convinced of something would have just been too great for them to overcome. Sure, they can bullshit their way through with the pink-haired college lesbians, and but outside of that, even now they're struggling, and they've got control of the media and everything. But we need to understand that representative democracy has changed. Tucker Carlson recently did a video with a guy. It's not a bad interview, actually. You check out, if you haven't already, check out Tucker Carlson's channel, and where they talked about really similar point to I'm making here, where the very nature and structure and definition of representative democracy has changed. Now, if you look at where the elites talk about populism, that's their new, and they sneer at populist, fucking Nazis. The idea that the government should be a representative democracy expressing will of the people, they've now reached a point where they view that as not only undesirable and something to be sneered at and an object of disdain, but something to be, you have to be insane to even want it or think it was any good anyway. And so this idea that the people should choose, the will of the people. And if you look at, say, Brexit or Trump being voted in, this is probably the clearest and most stark example of how these people, the new consensus class, how they, Brexit, when it was done, shocked them. And so everyone who voted for Brexit was a racist, Nazi, fascist, if not Hitler personally, the usual put downs. And then the British government, which is controlled by the globalist class, this new elite consensus class, artificial manufactured bullshit consensus, by the way. Yeah, and so they have done everything they can to undo Brexit and to do the opposite of the will of the people. Now, the same goes for Trump getting elected. The deep state did everything they could to frustrate his agenda and fuck him up at every turn. Vast resources were placed at disposal of any organisation, group, or whatever that would constantly engage in lawfare harassment of the government's political program and so on. So, any and all resources were made available to prevent Trump from getting elected in 2020, and if that involved artificially manufacturing 20 million votes out of thin air for Biden, they do it. They're prepared to do it. It's desirable to do it because the idea of representative democracy, the will of the people, is just, it's insane to even want that or think it's a good idea. We make the decisions. We make them. We tell those people what's going to happen. They don't have the decision. Sure, we'll give them the illusion of it, but that's all. So they think they're doing something good. And I've spoken to people that are members of the elite class where they say rigging elections is fine, provided you get what you want, because the will of the people and representative democracy is not the way to do things. So if we undermine it or prevent it or corrupt it, then we are the good guys by doing it. And I was talking to a number of people, but I was talking to a judge not long ago who's privately, and he lowers his voice and sort of looks around to make sure no one's listening. Privately is very concerned about the cases that are being brought to court because they're just ideological and political. They're nothing to do with has the law been broken or a crime committed. But if he speaks out against it or doesn't hear the cases or throws the cases out of court because they're so weak and flimsy, if he does that, he is convinced that he'll be targeted and he'll be out of a job, and he'll be publicly disgraced by a frail little wife of a woman's going, "Oh, he tried to rape me," or he's, kilos of white powder is going to appear in his house seconds before the police come in the door. He's convinced that the deep state would get him in some way and fuck him up. And the same goes for people, insanely over-promoted people being paid massive bucks, $500,000-$600,000 a year to be a director of diversity. And these are people that couldn't get a job sweeping floors in the real world, but they know that if they say, "Hey, this diversity stuff's bullshit," they'd be out of a job in a second. And they'd be publicly shamed, and gigabytes of child porn will be found on their computer. All sorts of things, and they're convinced that they have to go along with it. And so you're looking at all these institutions. So a lot of the consensus, not all of it, but a lot of it, if not the majority of the consensus, is being purchased by the deep state by stacking and infiltrating every institution they can lay their hands on with low quality, low IQ affirmative action diversity hires and saying, look, you're getting 10 times what you can, we're paying you 10 times what you could get in the real world. So you do what we want, otherwise you're fucked. And that's really where it's going. So we need to understand how the definition of democracy has morphed into elite consensus. And given that they're in all the institutions and hold all the levers of power, their consensus, as they see it at least, is all that matters. And they're determined to prevent the will of the people and representative democracy from ever coming back again. They're determined to do it. And they'll go to exceptional and extraordinary lengths to do it. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.